Chapter 7. Octavio Cantu had had his last treatment of the season. He put on his hat and rose from the chair. I noticed how the years had caved in his chest and wasted the muscles of his arms. His faded coat and pants were several sizes too big. Bulging sharply on the right side pocket was a large bottle of rum. It always happens when she finishes my treatments. I put her to sleep, he whispered to me, fixing his sunken and discolored eyes on Mercedes Peralta. I've talked to you too much today. Anyway, I can't figure out why you're interested in me. A wide smile creased his face as he held his walking stick between his thumb and wrist. He moved his arm back and forth so skillfully the cane appeared to be suspended in midair. Without saying another word, he walked out of the room. Doña Mercedes, I called softly, turning to her. Are you awake? Mercedes Peralta nodded. I'm awake. I'm always awake, even when I'm asleep, she said softly. That's the way I tried to stay a jump ahead of myself. I told her that since I had begun talking to Octavio Cantu, I had been plagued by deep, nagging questions. Could Octavio Cantu have avoided stepping into Victor Julio's shoes? And why did he repeat Victor Julio's life so completely? Those are unanswerable questions, Doña Mercedes replied. But let's go to the kitchen and ask Candelaria. She's got more sense than the two of us together. I'm too old to have sense, and you're too educated. With a beaming smile on her face, she took my arm, and we walked to the kitchen. Candelaria, engrossed in scrubbing the copper-plated bottoms of her precious stainless steel pots and pans, did not hear or see us approach. She let out a piercing, startled scream when Doña Mercedes nudged her arm. Candelaria was tall, with sloping shoulders and wide hips. I couldn't tell her age. She looked as much 30 as she looked 50. Her brown face was covered with tiny freckles, so evenly spaced they seemed to have been painted on. She dyed her dark curly hair a carrot red and wore dresses made from bold-colored printed cottons. Well, what are you doing in my kitchen? She asked, with feigned annoyance. The Musuya is obsessed with Octavio Cantu, Doña Mercedes explained. My God, Candelaria exclaimed. Her face expressed genuine shock as she looked up at me. Why him? She asked. Baffled by her accusing tone, I voiced the question I had just asked Doña Mercedes. Candelaria began to laugh. For a minute I was worried, she said to Doña Mercedes. Musuyas are weird. I remember that Musuya from Finland who used to drink a glass of urine after his dinner to keep his weight down. And the woman who came all the way from Norway to fish in the Caribbean Sea. To my knowledge, she never caught anything, but she had the boat owners fighting among themselves to take her out to sea. Laughing uproariously, the two women sat down. One never knows what goes on in the minds of Musuyas, Candelaria went on. They are capable of anything, she laughed, in spurts, each louder than the preceding one. Then she went back to scrubbing her pots. It looks like Candelaria thinks very little of your questions, Doña Mercedes said. I personally think that Octavio Cantu couldn't avoid stepping into Victor Julio's shoes. He had very little strength. That's why he was caught by that mysterious something I talked to you about. That something more mysterious than fate, Witches call it a witch's shadow. Octavio Cantu was very young and strong, Candelaria said all of a sudden. But he sat too long under Victor Julio's shadow. What is she talking about? I asked Doña Mercedes. When people are fading away, especially at the moment they die, they create with that mysterious something a link with other persons, a sort of continuity, Doña Mercedes explained. That's why children turn out just like their parents, or those who take care of old people follow into the steps of their wards. Candelaria spoke again. Octavio Cantu sat too long in Victor Julio's shadows, and the shadow sapped him. Victor Julio was weak, but upon dying the way he did, his shadow became very strong. Would you call the shadow the soul? I asked Candelaria. No, the shadow is something all human beings have, something stronger than their soul. She replied, seemingly annoyed. There you are, Musuya, Doña Mercedes said. Octavio Cantu sat too long on a link, a point where fate links lives together. He didn't have the strength to walk away from it. And, like Candelaria says, Victor Julio's shadow sapped him. Because all of us have a shadow, a strong or a weak one. We can give that shadow to someone we love, to someone we hate, or to someone who is simply available. If we don't give it to anyone, it floats around for a while after we die, before it vanishes away. I must have stared at her uncomprehendedly. She laughed and said, I've told you that I like witches. I like the way they explain events, even though it's hard to understand them. Octavio needs me to ease his burden. I do that through my incantations. He feels that unless I intervene, he will repeat Victor Julio's life, detail by detail. It's advisable, Candelaria blurted out, not to sit too long under anybody's shadow, unless you want to follow in his or her footsteps. Part 2, Chapter 8. I was anticipating the loud sounds that usually reverberated through the house every Thursday morning as Candelaria rearranged the heavy furniture in the living room. Wondering whether I had actually slept through the commotion, I walked down the silent corridor to the living room. Shafts of sunlight filtered through the cracks in the wooden panels that covered the two windows facing the street. The dining table with its 6 chairs, the dark sofa, the stuffed armchairs, the glass coffee table, and the framed prints of pastoral landscapes and bullfighting scenes on the walls were exactly as Candelaria had arranged them the previous Thursday. I walked out into the yard, where I found Candelaria, half hidden behind a hibiscus bush. Her frizzy, red-dyed hair had been brushed out of her face and was held in place by bejeweled combs. Twinkling gold loops dangled from her earlobes. Her lips and nails were a glossy red and matched the colors of her brightly printed cotton dress. Her large eyes under lids that never opened all the way betrayed a dreaminess that was at odds with her sharp, angular features and her crisp, almost brusque manner. What made you get up so early, Musuya? Candelaria asked. Rising, she tidied her wide skirt and the low-cut bodice of her dress that revealed a generous amount of her ample bosom. I didn't hear you move the furniture this morning, I said. Are you going out? Without answering, she hurried into the kitchen, her loose sandals slapping on her heels as she ran. I'm behind with everything today, she declared, stopping momentarily to get her foot back into the sandal that had slipped off. I'm sure you'll catch up, I said. I'll help you. I lit the wood in the cooking pit and set the table with the mismatched pieces of china. It's just 7:30, I remarked. You're only a half an hour late. As opposed to Doña Mercedes, who was totally indifferent to schedules, Candelaria divided her day into precisely timed tasks. Although no one ever sat down for a meal at the same time, Candelaria fixed breakfast at exactly 7. By 8 o'clock, she was mopping the floors and dusting the furniture. She was tall enough that she had to stretch only her arms to reach the spider webs in the corners and the dust on the lintels. And by 11 o'clock, the daily pot of soup was simmering on the stove. As soon as that was accomplished, she tended to her flowers. Watering can in hand, she first walked up and down the patio, then the yard, sprinkling her plants with loving care. At 2 o'clock sharp, she did the laundry, even if she only had one towel to wash. After the ironing was done, she read illustrated romances. In the evenings, she cut out magazine pictures and pasted them in photo albums. Ilio's godfather was here last night, she whispered. Doña Mercedes and I talked with him till dawn. She reached for the mortared corn cooked the evening before and began to knead the white dough for the corn cakes we ate for breakfast. He must be over 80 years old, and he still hasn't gotten over Ilio's death. Lucas Nunez blames himself for the boy's death. Who is Ilio? I asked. Doña Mercedes' son, Candelaria murmured, shaping the dough into round patties. He was only 18 when he died tragically. It was a long time ago. She brushed a strand of hair behind her ear, then added, You'd better not mention to her that I told you she had a son. She placed the corn cakes on the grill, spanning the cooking pit, then faced me, a devilish grin on her lips. You don't believe me, do you? She asked, but stopped me from responding by holding up one hand. I have to concentrate now on the coffee. You know how fussy Doña Mercedes gets if it isn't strong or sweet enough. I regarded Candelaria suspiciously. She was in the habit of telling me the most outlandish stories about the healer, such as the time when Doña Mercedes was apprehended by a group of Nazis during the Second World War and held captive in a submarine. She's a liar, Doña Mercedes had once confided. And even if she's telling the truth, she exaggerates it so much that it might as well be a lie. Candelaria, thoroughly unconcerned about my suspicions, wiped her face on the apron she had tied around her neck. Then, with a swift, abrupt movement, she turned around and hurried out of the kitchen. Watch over the corn cakes, she cried out from the corridor. I'm behind with everything today. Around midday, Mercedes Peralta finally woke up after sleeping through Candelaria's Thursday commotion, which was noisier than usual because of the hurry. Undecidedly, Doña Mercedes stood at the door of her room, squinting her eyes to adjust to the brightness. She rested against the door frame for a moment before venturing out into the corridor. I rushed to her side, and taking her arm, I led her to the kitchen. Her eyes were red. She had a frown and a sad look around her mouth. I wondered if she too had spent the night awake. There was always the possibility that Candelaria had indeed been telling the truth. Seemingly preoccupied, she studied the plate full of corn cakes. But instead of taking one, she broke off 2 bananas from the bunch hanging on one of the rafters. She peeled them, cut them into slivers, then daintily ate the bananas, 1 sliver at a time. Candelaria wants you to meet her parents, she said, delicately wiping the corners of her mouth. They live in the hills, close to the dam. Before I had a chance to say that I would be delighted, Candelaria came sauntering into the kitchen. You'll love my mother, she affirmed. She's small and skinny like you. And she also eats the whole day long. Somehow, I had never thought of Candelaria as having a mother. With a rapt smile, the 2 women listened attentively as I tried to make them understand what I meant by that. I assured them that categorizing certain people as the motherless type had nothing to do with age or looks, but was something elusive, remote quality that I couldn't quite explain. What seemed to delight Mercedes Peralta the most about my elucidation was that it failed to make any sense. She sipped her coffee pensively, then looked at me askance. Do you think I had a mother myself? She asked. She closed her eyes, and puckering up her mouth, she moved her lips as if she were sucking from a breast. Or do you believe I was hatched from an egg? She glanced up at Candelaria and in a serious tone pronounced, the Musuya is quite right. What she wants to say is that witches have very little attachment to parents or children. Yet they love them with all their might, but only when they are facing them, never when they turn their backs. I wondered if Candelaria was afraid I would mention Elio, for she stepped behind Doña Mercedes, gesticulating wildly for me to remain silent. Doña Mercedes seemed to be determined to read our thoughts. She first looked at me, then at Candelaria, with fixed, unblinking eyes. Sighing, she wrapped her hands around her mug and sipped the rest of her coffee. Elio was only a few days old when his mother, my sister, died, she said, looking at me. He was my delight. I loved him as though he were my own child. She smiled faintly, and after a short pause, she continued talking about Elio. She said that no one would have called him handsome. He had a wide, sensuous mouth, a flat nose with sprawling nostrils, and wild, kinky hair. But what made Elio irresistible to young and old alike were his big, black, and lustrous eyes, which shone with happiness and sheer well-being. At great length, Doña Mercedes talked about Elio's eccentricities. Although he was to become a healer like herself, he rarely spent any time thinking about healing. He was too busy falling in and out of love. During the day, he chatted the hours away with the young women and girls who came to see her. In the evenings, guitar in hand, he went to serenade his conquests. He hardly ever returned before dawn, except when he was unsuccessful in his amatory ventures. Then he was back early and entertained her with his witty, but never vulgar, renditions of his failures and successes. With morbid curiosity, I waited for her to talk about his tragic death. I felt disappointed when she glanced up at Candelaria. "Go and get my jacket," she murmured. "It gets windy in those hills where your parents live." She rose and, leaning against my arm, shuffled out into the yard. "Today, Candelaria will surprise you," she confided. "There are all kinds of delightful quirks about her. If you were to know only half of them, you would probably faint with shock." Doña Mercedes chuckled softly like a child, trying hard not to give away a secret. Chapter 9. Laughter, excited voices, and the blaring sound of jukebox music spilled from the small restaurants and bars that lined the street leading out of Carmina. Beyond the gas station, before the street joined the road, large trees on either side interlinked their branches to form arches, creating a dreamlike stillness. On the road we passed solitary shacks made out of cane plastered over with mud. They all had a narrow doorway, a few windows, and a thatched roof. Some of the huts were whitewashed, others just mud-colored. Flowers, mostly geraniums growing in discarded cooking pots and tin cans, hung from deep eaves. Majestic trees aglow with golden and blood-red blossoms shaded meticulously swept yards, where women were doing their wash in plastic tubs or spreading clothes to dry on bushes. Some greeted us with a slow smile, others with an imperceptible nod of their heads. Twice we stopped at a roadside stall where children sold fruit and vegetables picked from their gardens. Candelaria, sitting in the back seat of my Jeep, gave me directions. We passed a cluster of huts in the outskirts of a small town, and within moments, a blanket of fog enveloped us. A fog so thick I could barely see beyond the hood of the Jeep. "O Lord Jesus Christ," Candelaria began to pray, "come down and help us get through this devilish fog. Please, Holy Mary, Mother of God, come here to protect us. Blessed Saint Anthony, merciful Saint Teresa, divine Holy Ghost, gather around to help us." "You'd better stop it, Candelaria. Doña Mercedes cut in. What if the saints are indeed listening to you and answer your prayers? How are we going to get them all into the car? Candelaria laughed, then burst into song. Over and over, she repeated the first few lines of an aria from an Italian opera. Do you like it? She asked me, catching my glance in the rearview mirror. My father taught it to me. My father's Italian. He likes opera and taught me arias by Verdi, Puccini, and others. I glanced at Doña Mercedes for confirmation, but she had fallen asleep. It's true, Candelaria insisted, then proceeded to sing a few lines from arias of different operas. Do you know them too? She asked, after I had correctly guessed the opera to which some of them belonged. Is your father Italian too? No, I laughed. He's German. I don't really know much about operas, I confessed. The only thing he taught me about music was that Beethoven was nearly a demigod. Every Sunday, for as long as I lived at home, my father played all of Beethoven's symphonies. The fog lifted as abruptly as it had descended about us, unveiling chain after chain of bluish mountains. They seemed to extend forever across an emptiness of air and light. Following Candelaria's directions, I turned into a narrow dirt lane, angling sharply from the road. It was barely wide enough for the Jeep. Here it is, she cried out excitedly, pointing at the two-story house at the end of the lane. The whitewashed walls were yellow with age, and the once red tiles were gray and mossy. I parked, and we got out of the Jeep. An old man, clad in a frayed t-shirt, was leaning out an upstairs window. He waved at us and then disappeared, his loud, excited voice ringing through the silence of the house. Roraima! The witches are here! Just as we reached the front door, a small, wrinkled woman stepped out to greet us. Smiling, she embraced Candelaria, then Doña Mercedes. This is my mother, Candelaria proudly said. Her name is Roraima. After a slight hesitation, Roraima also embraced me. She was barely 5 feet and very lean. She wore a long black dress. She had thick black hair and the bright eyes of a bird. Her motions, too, were bird-like, dainty, and quick as she ushered us inside the dark vestibule, where a small light burned under a picture of Saint Joseph. Beaming with contentment, she told us to follow her along the wide, L-shaped gallery bordering the inside patio, where a lemon and guava tree shaded the open living dining room and the spacious kitchen. Mercedes Peralta whispered something in Roraima's ear, then continued down the corridor that led to the back of the house. For a moment, I stood undecided, then followed Candelaria and her mother up the stone stairs to the second floor, past a row of bedrooms, all of which opened onto the wide balcony running the length of the patio. How many children do you have? I asked, as we passed the fifth door. I have only Candelaria. The leathery wrinkles in Roraima's face deepened as she smiled. But the grandchildren from Caracas come to spend their holidays here. Aghast, I turned to Candelaria and stared into her dark, guarded eyes, in which a glimmer of amusement was just discernible. I didn't know you had any children, I said, wondering if this was the surprise Doña Mercedes had hinted at that morning. Somehow it was a letdown. How can I have children? Candelaria retorted indignantly. I'm a maiden. I burst into laughter. Her statement not only implied that she was unmarried, but that she was also a virgin. The haughty expression on her face left no doubt that she was very proud of the fact. Candelaria leaned over the railing. Then she turned and looked up. I've never told you that I have a brother. Actually, he's only a half a brother. He's much older than I. He was born in Italy. Like my father, he came to Venezuela to make his fortune. He has a construction company. He's rich now. Roraima nodded her head emphatically. Her half-brother has 8 children. They love to spend the summers here with us, she added. In a sudden change of mood, Candelaria laughed and embraced her mother. Imagine, she explained, the Musuya can't conceive that I have a mother. With an impish smile, she added, and what's even worse, she doesn't believe that I have an Italian father. At that very instant, one of the bedroom doors opened, and the old man I had seen at the window stepped out onto the balcony. He was stocky, with sharp, angular features that strongly resembled Candelaria's. He had dressed in a hurry. His shirt was buttoned up askew. The leather belt holding up his pants had not been fitted into the loops around the waist, and his shoelaces were untied. He embraced Candelaria. Guido Misoni, he introduced himself to me, then apologized for not welcoming us at the door. As a child, Candelaria was as pretty as Roraima, he said, holding his daughter in a warm embrace. Only when she grew up did she start to resemble me. Clearly sharing a private joke, all 3 burst into laughter. Giving a satisfied nod, Roraima regarded her husband and her daughter with unabashed admiration. She took my arm and led me downstairs. Let's join Doña Mercedes, she suggested. The yard, bordered by a stake fence, was enormous. At the farthest end stood an open hut with a thatched roof. Sitting in a hammock fastened to the cross beam of the hut was Mercedes Peralta. She was sampling Roraima's homemade cheese. She congratulated Roraima on her success. Guido Michoni stood irresolute in front of Doña Mercedes. He seemed unsure whether to shake her hand or to put his arm around her. She smiled at him, and he embraced her. We all sat around the hammock, except for Roraima, who sat in it beside Mercedes Peralta. She asked her questions about me, which Doña Mercedes promptly answered as if I were not there. For a while I listened to their conversation, but soon the heat, the stillness of the air, and Guido Michoni's and the women's low voices interspersed now and then by faint giggles, made me so drowsy I stretched out on the ground. I must have dozed off, for Doña Mercedes had a hard time making me understand that I was to check with Candelaria about lunch. I had not heard Candelaria and her father leave. I went inside the house. A deep, soothing voice, murmuring an incantation, came from one of the bedrooms. After that, Candelaria was entertaining her father with one of my tapes of a healing session. I rushed upstairs. On a previous occasion, she had played a tape and promptly erased it by pushing the wrong button. I stopped short at the half-open door. Speechless, I watched Candelaria massage her father's back and shoulders, while she softly mumbled an incantation. There was something about her stance, the concentrated yet fluid beauty of her moving hands, that reminded me of Mercedes Peralta. I realized then that Candelaria was also a healer. As soon as she finished massaging her father, she turned to face me, a glimmer of amusement in her eyes. "Did Doña Mercedes ever tell you about me?" Her voice had a curious softness that I had never heard before. She says that I was born a witch. There were so many questions running through my mind, I was at a loss where to begin. Candelaria, aware of my bewilderment, shrugged her shoulders in a sort of helpless gesture. "Let's fix lunch," Guido Michoni offered, heading for the stairs. Candelaria and I followed behind him. Suddenly he turned around and faced me. "Mercedes Peralta is right," he said, then bent his head and stared fixedly at the lacy shadows of the guava tree on the brick patio. For a long time he just stood there shaking his head now and then, unsure what to say or do next. He looked up, smiled faintly, then began to walk about the patio, his hands lightly touching flowers and leaves. His shiny eyes seemed not quite to take me in when they focused on me. "It's a strange story," he said to me in an excited voice that made his Italian accent more pronounced. "Candelaria says that Doña Mercedes wants me to tell it to you. You know that you're welcome here. I hope you come often so we can talk." I was at a loss. I looked at Candelaria, hoping for some kind of explanation. "I think I know what Doña Mercedes wants to do with you," Candelaria said. Taking my arm, she led me to the kitchen. "She likes you a lot, but she can't give you her shadow because she's got only one, and she's giving it to me." "What are you talking about?" I asked. "I'm a witch," she replied, "and I'm following in Doña Mercedes' footsteps. Only by following in the spiritual footsteps of a healer can you be a healer yourself. That's what's called a junction, a link. Doña Mercedes has already told you that witches call it a shadow. Shadows are true for everything," she continued. "And there is only one heir to anyone who has real knowledge." Victor Julio had real knowledge about killing dogs and made an unwitting link for Octavio Cantu. I've said to you that Octavio sat too long in Victor Julio's shadow, and that Doña Mercedes is giving me her shadow. By letting certain people tell you their stories, she is trying to put you, for an instant, under the shadow of all those people, so that you'll feel how the wheel of chance turns and how a witch helps that wheel move. Unsuccessfully, I tried to tell her that her statements were throwing me into a deeper confusion. She stared at me with bright, trusting eyes. When a witch intervenes, we say it's the witch's shadow that turns the wheel of chance, she said thoughtfully. Then, after pausing for a moment, she added, "My father's story would fit, but I shouldn't be present when he tells his story to you. I inhibit him. I always have." She looked back at her father and laughed. Her laughter was like a crystalline explosion. It reverberated through the whole house. Sleepless, Guido Michoni tossed in the bed and wondered if the night, made longer by Roraima's peaceful sleep, would ever end. An anxious expression crossed his face as he gazed at her naked body, dark against the white sheet, and at her face, hidden behind a tangled mass of black hair. Gently, he pushed the hair aside. She smiled. Her eyes opened slightly, shiny between the thick, stubby lashes, but she did not wake up. Taking care not to disturb her, Guido Michoni rose and looked out the window. It was almost dawn. In a nearby yard, a dog began to bark at a singing drunkard staggering down the street. The man's steps and song died away in the distance. The dog went back to sleep. Guido Michoni turned away from the window and squatted to reach under the bed for the small suitcase he kept hidden there. With the key he wore on a chain around his neck, along with the medal of the Virgin, he opened the lock and fumbled for the wide leather pouch tucked in between his folded clothes. An odd feeling, almost a premonition, made him hesitate for a moment. He did not tie the pouch around his waist. He reached inside, retrieved a heavy gold bracelet, placed it on the pillow beside Roraima, and put the pouch back into the suitcase. He shut his eyes tightly. His mind went back to the day he immigrated to Venezuela, 20 years ago. Tempted by the opportunities for work and the good pay. He had been only 26 years old, certain that his wife and their 2 children would soon join him. He had remained in Caracas for the first few years. To save money, he had lived in cheap rooming houses conveniently close to the construction sites where he was working. Each month he sent part of his savings home. After several years, he finally realized that his wife did not want to join him. He moved out of Caracas and accepted work in the interior. Letters from home reached him only sporadically, and then they stopped altogether. He no longer sent money. Instead, As so many of his co-workers did, he began to invest his salary in jewels. He was going to return to Italy, a rich man. A rich man, Guido Mincioni murmured, securing the suitcase with the leather strap. He wondered why the words no longer evoked the familiar excitement. He glanced at Roraima on the bed. He was already missing her. His mind went back almost a decade to that day he first saw Roraima in the courtyard of his cheap rooming house, where he was heating his spaghetti on a Primus cooker. She was hollow-eyed and wore a dress that was too large for her thin, slight frame. He thought her to be one of the children in the neighborhood who were always making fun of the foreigners, in particular, the Italian construction workers. But Roraima had not come to mock the Italians. She had been hired to work at the boarding house. And at night, for a few coins, she shared the men's beds. To the annoyance of his co-workers, she attached herself to Guido so devotedly that she refused to sleep with anyone else, no matter how much money they offered. One day, however, she disappeared. No one knew where she had come from. No one knew where she had gone. 5 years later, he saw her again. For some inexplicable whim, instead of driving out with the crew to the barracks next to the site where a factory and a pharmaceutical laboratory were being built, he took a bus all the way into town. There, sitting in the bus depot, as if waiting for him, was Roraima. Before he had quite recovered from his surprise, she called to a little girl playing nearby. "This is Candelaria," she pronounced, grinning up at him disarmingly. "She's 4 years old, and she's your daughter." There was something so irrepressibly childish in her voice, in her expression. He couldn't help but laugh. As frail and slight as she remembered her, Roraima looked like the sister rather than the mother of the child standing beside her. Candelaria looked at him in silence. The veiled expression of her dark eyes made him think of someone very old. She was tall for her age. Her face was serious, as only a child's could be. She shifted her gaze to the children she had been playing with. When she looked up at him again, there was an impish gleam in her eyes. "Let's go home," she said, taking his hand and pulling him forward. Unable to resist the firm pressure of her tiny palm, he went with her down the main street to the outskirts of town. They stopped in front of a small house, fenced in by a row of corn stalks waving in the breeze. The cement blocks were unplastered, and the corrugated zinc sheets of the roof were held in place with large stones. "Candelaria finally brought you here," Roraima stated, reaching for the small suitcase in his hand. "And to think that I almost stopped believing that she was born a witch." She invited him inside to a small hall that opened into a wide room, empty except for 3 chairs arranged against the wall. One step down was a bedroom partitioned off by a curtain. On one side, beneath a window, stood a double bed on which Roraima dropped his suitcase. On the other side hung a hammock in which the child went to lie down. He followed Roraima along a short corridor into the kitchen and sat down at the wooden table in the middle of the room. Guido Miccioni took Roraima's hands in his, and, as though clarifying matters to a child, he told her that what had brought him to town wasn't Candelaria, but the dam that was going to be built in the hills. No, that's only the surface. You came because Candelaria brought you here, Roraima stammered. Now, you'll stay here with us, won't you? Seeing that he remained silent, she added, Candelaria was born a witch. With an encompassing wave of her hand, Roraima took in the room, the house, the yard. All this belongs to her. Her grandmother is a famous healer and gave her all this. Her voice dropped, and she muttered the words. But that's not what she wanted. She wanted you. Me? He repeated, shaking his head sad and baffled. He had never lied to Roraima about his family in Italy. I'm sure her grandmother is a good healer, but being born a witch? That's pure nonsense. You know that one day I will return to the family that I left behind. A strange, disturbing smile filtered across Roraima's face as she reached for the pitcher and for the turned-down glass on the table. She filled it, then held the glass out to him and added, Miccioni, this tamarind water has been bewitched by your daughter, Candelaria. If you drink it, you'll stay with us forever. For a second, he hesitated, then burst into laughter. Witchcraft is nothing but superstition. He emptied his glass in one long gulp. That was the best refreshment I have ever had, he remarked, holding out the glass for more. His daughter's faint coughing broke into his reveries. He tiptoed to the other side of the partitioned-off room and anxiously bent over Candelaria sleeping in a hammock that hung from 2 rings cemented into the wall. A sad smile parted his lips as he peered into her little face, in which so often he had tried to discover a likeness to himself. He saw none. But, oddly enough, there were times the girl made him think of his grandfather. It was not so much a resemblance, but rather a mood, a certain gesture made by the child, which never failed to startle him. She also had that same easy way with animals that the old man had had. She healed every donkey, cow, goat, dog, and cat in the neighborhood. She actually coaxed birds and butterflies to perch on her outstretched arms. His grandfather had had that same gift. A saint, people had called him in the small town in Calabria. Whether or not there was anything saintly about Candelaria, he was no longer sure. One afternoon, he had found the child lying on her stomach in the yard, her chin resting on her folded arms, talking to a sickly-looking cat curled up a few inches in front of her. The feline seemed to be answering her. not with meowing sounds, but with short grunts that resembled an old man's laughter. The instant they felt his presence, both Candelaria and the cat leapt up in the air, as if some invisible thread had pulled them. They landed right in front of him, a spooky smile on their faces. He had stood bewildered. As for a fleeting instant, their features appeared to be superimposed on each other's. He had been unable to decide whose face belonged to whom. Ever since that day, he had kept wondering about what Roraima always said. That Candelaria was not a saint, but a witch. Softly, so as not to wake her, Guido Machuni caressed the child's cheek, and then tiptoed to the small vestibule, lit dimly by the dying light of an oil lamp. He reached for his jacket, hat, and shoes, laid out the evening before, and finished dressing. He held the lamp up to the mirror and studied his image. At 46, his gaunt, weather-worn face was still filled with that indestructible energy that had carried him through years of hard work. His hair, although gray-streaked, was still thick, and his light brown eyes shone brightly beneath his bushy brows. Cautiously, without stepping on the dog whining and twitching its leg in sleep, he let himself out the door. He leaned against the wall and waited until his eyes adjusted to the shadows. Sighing, he watched the early workers heading toward work like phantoms in the emptiness of the pre-dawn darkness. Instead of going to the southern end of town, where a truck waited to take the laborers to the construction site of the dam in the hills, Michoni headed toward the plaza, where the bus for Caracas was parked. The faint light inside the bus blurred the shapes of the few passengers dozing in their seats. He moved to the very back, and as he lifted his suitcase to the rack above him, he saw a shadow through the grimy window of the bus. Black and immense, the shadow stood out against the white wall of the church. He didn't know what made him think of a witch. Although he wasn't religious, he quietly began to pray. The shadow dissolved into a faint cloud of smoke. The dimming of the lights in the plaza must have played a trick on his eyes, he thought, and chuckled. Roraima and Candelaria would have explained it differently. They would have said that he had seen one of those nocturnal entities that wander about at night. Beings that never leave any trace, but use mysterious signals to announce their presence and disappearance. The ticket collector's voice cut into his musings. Michoni paid his fare, asked about the best way to go to the port of La Guara, and then closed his eyes. Rattling and swaying, the bus crossed the valley, then slowly ascended the dusty winding road. Machoni sat up and looked back for one last time. The retreating rooftops, the white church with its bell tower, kept swimming through his tear-filled eyes. How he loved the sound of those bells. Now, he will never hear them again. After resting for a moment under the elusive shade of the blooming almond trees in the plaza, Guido Miccioni resumed his walk up the steep, narrow street that ended in a flight of crooked steps carved into the hill. He climbed halfway up, then turned to gaze at the port below him. La Guaira, a city crowded in between the mountains and the sea, with its pink, blue, and buff-colored houses, its twin church towers, and its old custom house overlooking the harbor like some ancient fort. His daily excursions to this secluded spot had become a necessity. It was the only place where he felt safe and at peace. Sometimes he spent hours up here watching the large ships dropping anchor. He tried to guess by their flags or the color of their smokestacks to which country they belonged. His weekly visits to the shipping offices in town were as essential to his well-being as gazing at the ships. It had been a month since he left Roraima and Candelaria, and he was still undecided whether he should return to Italy directly or by way of New York. Or, as Mr. Hilkema at the shipping office had suggested, perhaps see something of the world first and board one of those German freighters that sailed to Rio Buenos Aires, across to Africa, and then the Mediterranean Sea. But regardless of how enticing the possibilities, he couldn't bring himself to book his passage back to Italy. He couldn't understand why, and yet, in the depths of him, he knew. He climbed to the top of the steps and turned into a narrow, twisting path that led to a clump of palm trees. He sat on the ground, his back against the trunk, and fanned himself with his hat. The stillness was absolute. The palm fronds hung motionless. Even the birds seemed to be floating effortlessly, like falling leaves pinned to the cloudless sky. He heard a faint laughter echoing in the silence. Startled, he looked around. The tinkling sound reminded him of his daughter's laughter. And suddenly, her face materialized before his eyes. A fleeting image, unsubstantial, floating in some tenuous light. So pale, it seemed her face was surrounded by a halo. With quick, abrupt movements, as though he were trying to erase the vision, Guido Miccioni fanned himself with his hat. Perhaps it was true that Candelaria was born a witch, he mused. Could the child be indeed the cause for his inclusion to leave? He asked himself. Was she the reason for his inability to bring to mind the faces of his wife and children in Italy, regardless of how hard he tried? Guido Miccioni rose and scanned the horizon. For an instant he thought he was dreaming, as he saw a large ship emerge like some mirage through the shimmering heat. The vessel came closer, angling toward the harbor. In spite of the distance, he clearly recognized its green, white and red smokestack. "An Italian ship!" he exclaimed, throwing his hat up in the air. He was certain that he had finally broken the spell of Venezuela and of Roraima and Candelaria. Superstitious creatures who read omens in the flight of birds, the movement of shadows, the direction of the wind. He laughed happily. This ship approaching the harbor, like some miracle, was his liberation. In his excitement, he stumbled several times as he hurried down the crooked steps. He ran past the old colonial houses. He had no time to stop and listen to the sound of water splashing in the fountains and the songs of caged birds spilling out of open windows and doors. He was going to the shipping offices. He was going to book his passage home this very day. A child's voice calling his full name brought him up short. Overcome by a sudden dizziness, he closed his eyes and leaned against the wall. Someone gripped his arm. He opened his eyes, but all he saw were black spots whirling in front of him. Again he heard a child's voice call his name. Slowly his dizziness subsided. With his eyes still unfocused, he glanced into the worried face of Mr. Hilkema, the Dutchman at the shipping office. "I don't know how I got here, but I want to speak with you," Guido Michoni stammered. "From the hill, I've just seen the Italian ship approach the harbor. I want to book my passage home this very instant." Mr. Halkaima shook his head in disbelief. "Are you sure?" he asked. "I want to book my passage home," Michoni insisted childishly. "Right now." Upon catching Mr. Halkaima's eyes on him, eloquent with meaning, he added, "I have finally broken the spell." "Of course you have," Mr. Halkaima patted him reassuringly on the shoulder, and then steered him toward the cashier. Looking up, Guido Michoni watched the tall, gaunt Dutchman move behind the counter. As usual, Mr. Halkaima was dressed in a white linen suit and black cloth sandals. A fringe of gray hair growing on one side of his head had been carefully combed and distributed over his naked skull. His face had been aged by the relentless tropical sun, and no doubt by rum. Mr. Halkaima brought out a heavy ledger and placed it noisily on the counter. He pulled up a chair, sat down, and began to write. "There are some of us who are meant to stay here," he said, then lifted his pen and pointed to Michoni. "And you, my friend, are never going to return to Italy." Guido Michoni, not quite knowing what to make of his words, bit his lip. Mr. Halkaima burst into a loud, toneless laughter, which sprung from the depths of his belly, moving up with a rumbling, painful sound. But when he spoke, his voice had a curious softness. "I was just joking. I'll take you to the ship myself." Mr. Halkaima had gone with him to his hotel and helped him gather his belongings. After making sure he had a cabin all to himself as he had requested and paid for, the Dutchman left him with the ship's purser. Still dazed, Guido Miccioni glanced around him, wondering why there was no one on the deck of the Italian ship anchored at Pier 9. He reached for a chair beside a table on the deck, straddled it, and rested his forehead against the wooden back. He wasn't insane. He was in the Italian ship, he repeated to himself, hoping to dispel the realization that there was no one around. As soon as he had rested a moment, he'd walk down to another deck and confirm for himself that the crew and the rest of the passengers were somewhere in the ship. The thought restored his confidence. Guido Miccioni rose from his chair and, leaning over the railing, looked down at the pier. He saw Mr. Hakayama waving, looking up at him. "Miccioni," the Dutchman shouted, "the ship is pulling anchor. Are you sure you want to go?" Guido Miccioni felt a cold sweat. An immeasurable fear took possession of him. He longed for his peaceful life, for his family. "I don't want to go," he shouted back. "You have no time to get your luggage. The gangplank has been lifted. You must jump now. You'll land in the water. If you don't jump now, you'll never make it." Guido Miccioni vacillated for an instant. In his suitcase were the jewels he had hoarded over the years, working with almost inhuman strength. Was all that going to be lost? He decided he still had enough strength to start all over again and jumped over the railing. Everything blurred. He braced himself for the impact with the water. He was not worried. He was a good swimmer. But the impact never came. He heard Mr. Hakayama's voice saying loudly, "I think this man has fainted. The bus cannot leave until we take him out. Someone get his suitcase." Guido Miccioni opened his eyes. He saw a black shadow against the white wall of the church. He didn't know what made him think of a witch. He felt that he was being lifted and carried away. And then he had a devastating realization. "I've never left. I've never left. It's been a dream," he kept repeating. He thought of his jewels in his suitcase. He was sure that whoever grabbed his suitcase would steal it. But the jewels no longer mattered to him. He had already lost them in the ship.